Chapter 2 got really long. It's about a 90-minute lecture, and I'd ask that you not do it all at once if possible. If you could stop and take at least some kind of a break in the place. I have a place in it where I tell you to stop and take a break. A lot of things to enter. I think there's 30 entry points where I ask you to do different things. I tried to organize it so that it made sense to you. I show you the outline at the beginning so you can kind of see the order it's coming. But best of luck with this, and it's just a flyover, the history of education. You can do a whole course on it, and we're trying to do it in just one chapter here. So Chapter 2, History. The early history of education in a changing world, and is it ever a changing world? And the image on this is of Aristotle and Socrates. You didn't know that they played a huge role in education, but they do, and they do a nice job of laying that out here. I'm really happy this... there's a number of things I disagree with in this textbook, but one thing they do right away is lay this out about history. And if you will allow me just to read this, and then I'll make a point about it. This is the introduction of this chapter on the history of education. This part of the book briefly surveys the history of education. As you read this chapter, remember that historians see past events with various perspectives. Celebrationist historians, for instance, tend to see the brighter side of historical events and may tend, for example, to praise schools for past accomplishments. By contrast, liberal historians tend to study educational history through a perspective that focused on conflict, stress, inconsistencies. Revisionist historians use yet another perspective, seeing celebrationist history as fundamentally flawed, and concluding that we often learn more by studying what went wrong with education than by rehearsing what has been right. Postmodernist historians believe that a person sees the history of education through the unique perspective of her or his social class, race, ethnicity, gender, age, and so on. We, meaning the authors, challenge you to think critically as you read this and the next chapter, and to formulate your own perspectives through the view of history, educational history. Now, I'm glad they got that out there, and one of the things that I'll say is this textbook, even though they put this out there, they have a very distinct position, and that's as a liberal historian. And they tend to focus on what was wrong and imply throughout a number of places that how bad our post-education, our pre-education was. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it's just so interesting that they'll make assertions that they have nothing to back it up. So here is number 1 on this, and that is that you will, let me make number 1 here, you will bring in a little description of each of these so that you remember what these are. In history, not only this history of education, but in a history class, in a history book, this same thing applies. What is the perspective of the author or of the professor? So as you sit in a class of history, and I know to get a degree at our school, you need to have at least 2 history classes, asking yourself, what is their perspective? Because often, not only in history, but in all university things, that it tends to be this liberal historic perspective. What is wrong, how bad, how unfair, how unjust it is. And what I think is unusual is a professor that you couldn't have a balanced approach. And they don't do a very good job of bringing that. So this is the eyes that they bring through here, is the liberal perspective. And they kind of stick with that, not only in this chapter, but all the whole textbook. And if it's all the same to you, I'm going to push back on that continuously. And I just want to get that out there also. Now, also as an introduction here, let me tell you, if you're a person of faith, you're not going to like this chapter either, because they stomp all over that and criticize, and especially if you're of the Christian faith and of Catholic background, they're going to go into some things that you're not aware of. Full disclosure, I went to a Catholic school, and I had never heard of the Reformation until I was an adult. And so you have that to look forward to also. So with that, I also want to flip over here and go out to the website and just show you the note outline to see what we're going into here. This is going to be a long chapter, has a lot of things. The evolution of schooling, some way back BC here, and then in the Middle Ages, they consider about 476 to 1300, these folks and their contributions, and then in a transitional period, 1300 to 1700, you have these folks, and then an educational awakening from 1700 on, and a number of contributions of these folks, and then kind of this evolving perspectives from the colonies, and some of those things, and these people here, and then teaching materials. They do a short thing on teaching materials, and then they, as I said, this perspective that they take on everything, they spend a huge part of the chapter talking about how bad our system is and how unjust we are. And it goes through all this, and of course they slant it to suit their needs, and I will try and point that out as we walk through this together. But nonetheless, you see a lot of material, a lot of things for you to kind of keep straight, and I think it's organized in a way that you can do that. So let's give it a go here. So here's the evolution of schooling, and it talks about the evolution, but it makes this claim here in the blue. And when I say this, a lot of times I'll point to this in the blue stuff I have highlighted. Unfortunately, records do not exist that would help us better understand this earliest informal educational system. If such records did exist, we'd probably be quite impressed with the educational efforts of their Aboriginal ancestors. Okay, and here's the thing, and this is on the test, so I want you to get this. As written language came into use, humans felt the need for more formal education. And as the society got more complex, that was one thing that emerged, was written language. And that's when, even in the earliest times, we saw that. So first of all, non-Western, and this is in reference that you would have this understanding of Western civilization and non-Western. Non-Western being like Asia. The term schools first came into existence, however, the discovery of these books. There is also evidence of suggest that formal schools existed in China during Heisha and Shang dynasties, perhaps as early as 200 or 2000 BC. But again, up here it says we don't have any good concrete effort or records of that. And Western education was until about 500 BC that a Western society advanced sufficiently to generate this. This happened in Greece during the Age of Pericles, 451 to 431 BC. Okay, and I have that here. And I have that here. And here's this here. The form from school probably existed in summer in China, circa, reached west about 500 BC. And so right here, Age of Pericles, and this is number 2, is you define what that is. Google that and put up here with the Age of Pericles, because that also is on the test, is defining Western education. Okay. Greece consists of many city-states, one of which was Sparta. You've heard of them, Spartans, Michigan State Spartans. It's a form of this, the Spartas in Greece, and they were a militaristic state whose educational system was geared to support military ambitions. So they wanted schools to train their military. Why would you want your military? Well, because they wanted a strong military to support themselves and protect themselves. So the aim of their education was, as you can imagine, centered around developing this, such ideals as courage, patriotism, obedience, cunning, and physical strength. This Plutarch, a writer of later times, said that the education of the Spartans was calculated to make them subject to command, to endure labor, to fight, to conquer. There was relatively little intellectual content of the Spartan education. So in other words, they wanted to train and educate their people as soldiers, not to think, not to reason, but just follow orders and obey. And in sharp contrast to Sparta was Athens, another Greek city, in which development educational program was heavily stressed for intellectual and aesthetic objectives. Between the age of 8 and 16, the Athens boys attended a series of public schools, and the schools included grammar, taught reading, writing, counting, gymnastics schools, which taught sports and games, all of those things. So that was the difference between Athens and Sparta in Greece. Okay. And then we talk about the first great philosophers that came from Athens. Why? Because they taught these things. And those you've heard before, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So what did they do? Well, Socrates, his thing was the Socratic method. Let me show you what that is here, a Socratic method. I'm going to make this number 3, and you will define what a Socratic method is, what that had to do with this. Incidentally, some historians speculate that Socrates might not have really even existed, but rather have been a mythical character created by other writers, because that even happens today sometimes. So we don't even know. They're contending that Socrates maybe didn't even exist. And we don't have good evidence of that, but there was writings from him that had possibly been done by somebody else. Let's go to Plato. The student disciple in his Republic, Plato set forth his recommendations for an ideal society. He suggests society should contain 3 classes of people. And that's what I want you to do here, this 3-tier system. Here's number 4. You put in what are those 3 tiers. 1, 2, 3. And they're right there on the page where I was. And make sure you turn them red so I can find everything that you enter here, or some off color. That's what Plato did. And then Aristotle, like Plato, believed that a person's most important purpose in life was to serve and improve mankind. Aristotle's education method, however, was scientific, practical, and objective, in contrast to philosophical methods of Socrates and Plato. But the quality of study was determined by the quality of education. Early Greek philosophers, including Plato and Aristotle, articulated the idea that females and slaves did not possess the intelligence to be leaders, and therefore should not be educated. Unfortunately, our world's current struggle with racism and sexism, deeply rooted in Western civilization, is traceable to the ancient world. And what I understand, I thought in the past was, as time went on, that the thought more so of not of that they weren't intelligent enough, but that wasn't necessary to do what their contributions were. But this fits the narrative of the perspective of these authors, so they like that. Okay, education for improvement of humankind. All believe that educated women were useless. And I say, I don't believe that to be true. More, that wasn't necessary. But, I say, it fits their narrative. Then Roman schools, 146 BC, the Romans conquered Greece. And what did they do after they conquered them? They had the Greeks. They took their teachers and their educational system, and they quickly absorbed it into the Roman Empire. Many of the advances made by the Roman Empire after that time in education were actually inspired by enslaved Greeks. And before that, Roman children were educated primarily in the home through some children attended schools known as ludis, where the rudiments of reading and writing were taught. But the Greek influence on Roman education became pronounced between 50 BC and 200 after, when an entire system of schools developed. And that was the beginning of the Latin grammar school here highlighted. We're somewhat like the 20th century schools today, preparing for a career in political service, receiving their training in schools and rhetoric. Okay. And then Quintilian, one of the most influential Roman educators, was Quintilian. In a set of 12 books, the Institutes of Oratory, he described current educational practices, recommended type of systems. And regarding this, let him be soothed and caressed, I have here. Quintilian believed that the children needed this as a diversion, that it should be something fun that they desired to do, and therefore it had to be enjoyable. Comment applies today as when Quintilian was nearly 2,000 years ago, discovered influential in the humanist movement in education. Humanistic movement in education, do you know what that is? Well, here I'm going to ask you to find out. So what I'm going to have you do is come over here, and I'm going to put this in here. Okay. Humanistic educational philosophy, and I got to put this. You'll take this out of your notes, and we'll take it to a browser, and we'll see if we can find out what that is. And here's what you do. find it. Here's one from Wikipedia. I'm going to have you look at this, but I want you to connect where it came from. So I'm going to copy this URL, come back to my notes, block this like this, and I'm going to put an URL in here so I can see where it comes from. So you move up here to insert, and here is a hyperlink. Then you drop it in this hyperlink, tell it okay, and you have it. But you're not done. Now you're going to add your comments, and this is how you're going to do that. You come down here to review and put a comment, and you'll get a thing like this, a balloon like this. Here's where you put your comments of what this is. And doesn't have to be long, but you tell me what this humanistic educational philosophy is about. All right, and then when I look at your notes, this is what I'll see, is this little balloon here. Okay? That's how I want you to put this in your notes. All right. And that is for Quintolin here and humanistic here. And this is, so this will be number 4. Again, make it red so I can see it. The humanistic movement. Then the Romans had genius for organization, for getting the job done. They built tall structures, architects that stand today. It was a mighty and strong country, the Romans, and lots is written about it. And it was one of those 6, they say 6 of the great 7 world powers in the history of this world fell from within, and that's basically what happened to the Romans also. And we're getting a first-hand look at it ourselves right now. So there's that, and skills impacted ancient world. So let's go on to this part now that, if you're a person of faith, is going to make you squirm a little bit. 476, the fall of Roman Empire. The Roman Catholic Church was well on the way to becoming the greatest power in government and education in the Western world. In fact, the rise of the church of power is often cited the main reason the Western world's plunge into the Dark Ages. So that's the contention here, that the church, the Christian church, caused this plunge on education. Church stressed the importance of gaining entrance to heaven. Life on earth became less important. Many people viewed earthly life as nothing more than a way to a better life in the hereafter. You can see that a society in which this attitude prevailed would less likely to make intellectual advances, except perhaps in the areas of tangential to religion. Because that's contention. So you're a person of faith, that's a pretty serious accusation. But it goes on. Talks about these dark ages between 400 and 1000. It's a period when much of the Western world was learning, and knowledge didn't just stand still, but actually regressed. The assertion is, and in this time, knowledge in the humans regressed, didn't stay the same. And it was due to a variety of conditions, including political and religious oppression of the common people. There were some examples of human progress during that time, but it's not very well documented. Another example of differing perspectives in which historians view the past. Okay, it depends on which of those 4 perspectives that we talked about at the beginning, and you can see now where the perspective of these authors is coming from. And at least they admit that here, that it still comes up to these differing perspectives. So then a man named Charlemagne came along in the Dark Ages, and was a reign of Charlemagne. Charlemagne realized the value of education, a ruler of a large part of it. He was in a position to establish schools and encourage scholarly activity. 768 he became into power. Activity was extremely low. The church conducted little educating that was carried on mainly to induct people into the faith or train religious leaders. So again, that's their assertion, which it was, because if their belief was your purpose was to serve God and serve others and gain entrance into heaven, that is how you would train people. And the schools where this religious teaching took place included different catechums and stuff, which taught church doctrine to new converts. Okay. We have this nice person, Alcuin. Charlemagne fought far and wide for a talented educator who would improve things in the kingdom. Finally, he selected Alcuin, formerly a teacher in England. While Alcuin served as Charlemagne's chief educational advisor, he became the most famous educator of his day. He reported that Charlemagne himself often sat in that school with Alcuin. Roughly during Acuin's time, the phrase 7 liberal arts came into the common usage of describe the curriculum that was to be taught. The phrase liberal arts has survived and commonly used now as this. And this is your number 5. What are those 7 liberal arts that Alcuin so readily adhered to that lives on today? You identify those 7 that live on in our liberal arts colleges today. And it comes right here on page 31. So now we're to the revival of learning. Despite the efforts of men as Charlemagne and Alcuin, little educational progress was made during those dark ages. Can you see that's a matter of perspective? Dark ages, that it depends which of those 4 perspectives that you're used to looking at things through. All right. Period frequently referred to as the revival, humankind slowly gained a thirst for education. This revival of interest in learning was supported by a rediscovery of writings of some of the ancient philosophers, mainly Aristotle. So then in this revival, a man named Thomas Aquinas. Yeah, if you're a person of faith, you recognize that name. Thomas Aquinas, more than any other person, helped to change the church's views on learning. Okay? Thomas said this change led to the creation of new learning institutions in medieval universities. Harmonization of the doctrines of the church with doctrines of philosophy and education were rooted in the ideas of Aristotle. Him as a theologian, Aquinas formalized socialisticism. The main thing, the authority of the Catholic Church. She became this authority of the Catholic Church. Aquinas formalized Thomism, philosophy that was remained important in Rome, and Catholic parochial education. But the thing that Thomas did, Aquinas, he harmonized the doctrines of the church with that of philosophy. Said they could coexist. That you can be reverent to God and still be educated. And that's where they'd kind of gotten away from that. And so here is, this is number 6. What is this? Socialisticism. And you're going to tell me about that here. And of course, Thomas Aquinas had this harmony with church doctrine and philosophy and established these medieval universities. Well, let's look what they are. Here in the blue, medieval universities were true forerunners of the modern universities, including the University of Barcelona, University of Paris, Oxford, and University of Salerno. By the time Columbus sailed to North America in 1492, approximately 80 universities already existed in Europe. So that's what the medievals were. Produced a few educational advances in the Western world. Must remember that much of Eastern world did not experience the Dark Ages. Muhammad, there again you get to see the perspective of these authors bragging Muhammad, because he led a group of Arabs later captured northern Africa, southern Spain, and so Muhammad saved the day, and that was good for them, so to speak. Right. So I'm going to have this number 7, and that is you're going to name these early medieval universities, because I want you to bring those back later and what they stood for, what they were about. But they're right here on page 31. University of Paris, Oxford, University of Salerno. I missed one here. University of Bologna. Okay, that's your number 7. And then the transition, the Renaissance. And here's where you're a person of faith. You're not going to like this part. In fact, you're going to maybe want to shut this off and walk away from it. But the Renaissance and Reformation, if you're brought up Catholic like I was, you probably never heard of these, especially the Reformation. But it's this fracturing of the Catholic Church, of the Christian Church. And it explains that pretty well here. Two very important movements took place in 13 to 1700, the Renaissance and Reformation. The Renaissance represented the protest of individuals against the dogmatic authority of the church. Remember, we said the church had all the power and they exerted over their social and intellectual life. And the Renaissance started in Italy, and when people reacquired the spirit of free inquiry that had prevailed, the Renaissance slowly spread through Europe and resulting in a general revival of classical learning called humanism. Remember, you did a little research before what humanism was and humanistic educational philosophy? Well, as you know now, the humanism is that God is not the highest power, that the human is the highest power above God. So if you believe in God, you still believe that you're above God, and you certainly don't believe God is a higher power. So that's what was starting here, and this is really has a rejuvenation here in our schools and in our country here in the last few years. People not believing God is the power, God is sovereign. And so very interesting how this is now reemerging. The second movement, the Reformation, where the Renaissance and the Reformation represents an action against certain beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church. One was against the oppression. That's the Renaissance. Reformation is the beliefs of the church. You got to separate the two. Particularly those discouraged learning, and that it inconsistently kept lay people in ignorance. Okay, so let's go on here what this is about. A little more about the Renaissance. If you allow me this top part, common people were generally oppressed by wealthy landowners and royalty during the 11th and 12th century. In fact, common people were thought to be unworthy of education and to exist primarily to serve land, gentry, and royalty. The Renaissance represented a rebellion on the part of the common people against the suppression they experienced from both the church and the wealthy who controlled their lives. So the Renaissance is their oppression about the control. Remember, the Reformation is about the beliefs. So this person, Vittorino di Feltre, had an influence on this time. He studied at the University of Florence, where he developed an interest in teaching, and his claim was he began to believe that people could be educated and also be Christians at the same time. Now that, to you and I, it doesn't sound like a revelation, but at that time it was. That was his thing. And the next one, Erasmus, is one of the most famous humanist educators. Remember the humanists? Okay. And that was his thing. Let's go take a look. Humanistic theory of education, and he rekindles interest in knowledge because of his understanding of what the church meant. So here's the Reformation. Again, if you're a person of faith, especially if you're Catholic, I'm going to contend again, probably didn't study this, but this is what happened to the church. It's difficult for people today to imagine the extent to which the Roman Catholic Church dominated the lives of common people through most of what is now Europe during the 15th and 16th century. The church and the Pope had enormous influence over European royalty during this time. In fact, some historians suggest that the Pope and other church officials were in some ways more powerful than individual kings and queens. After all, the Roman Catholic Church could and frequently did claim that unless members of royalty abided by its rules, they were destined to spend eternity in hell. An extremely frightening prospect for any human being, and consequently it was understandable that the church wielded great influence through most of Europe. So you can see how the place of the church got out of whack here. And here's who was responsible for this Reformation, a priest by the name of Martin Luther. And he had 95 grievances, which stated the disagreements he had with that Roman Catholic Church. One of these disagreements held that great implications of the importance of formal education. The church believed that it was not necessary for each person to read and interpret the Bible, and that is pervasive today. And when I went to Catholic school, that was not part of the study whatsoever. We studied church doctrine and church teachings, not the Bible. Rather, the church would pass on correct interpretation to the laity, meaning that only a priest could interpret the Bible. Luther found not only that the church had itself misinterpreted the Bible, but also had people with intended to read and interpret the Bible for themselves. If one accepted the church's position on this matter, formal education remained relatively unimportant for the masses. If one accepted Luther's position, however, education became important for all people. They might read and interpret the Bible for themselves. And that was his big thing. And you're going to find, as we go forward in this history of education, that is pervasive almost to modern day. Well, I shouldn't say that. Into about the 20th century. That the main thing for education was so you could read the Bible and interpret the Bible. In a sense, education became important in this way in obtaining salvation. Salvation, are you familiar with that term? Salvation means your ability to go into heaven and be with Jesus forever and ever. So that's where Martin Luther felt that the Catholic Church was becoming corrupt in their beliefs. And what he really questioned was the Catholic Church's way of interpreting the Bible. They really got away from a literal interpretation. And if they were going to obtain salvation, they needed a literal interpretation. Let me see what I have on that about against the church, rebels against the church, believe people should interpret the Bible for themselves. And so Ignatius of Loyola, to combat the Reformation movements, he came up with his own Society of Jesus. The Jesuits worked to establish schools to further the cause of the Roman Catholic Church, and they tried to stem the flow of converts to the cause of Reformation. Although the Jesuits' main interest in religion, they soon grew into great teaching order, the very successful training of their own teachers. In other words, to propagate the Catholic faith, he started this system up. And so what I want you to do with Ignatius here, what was his response? And this is number 8. What was this response? Again, make it red so I can find it. The same time, Comenius, Johann Amos Comenius, is perhaps the best remembered for his textbooks. His books were among the first to obtain illustrations. Picture books! Who doesn't like those? And can you imagine how that would have changed education? Because you and I don't know a time of that, but that was a huge breakthrough. And nowadays, with the technology we have, that we can almost construct learning and education out of images and pictures. We have all kinds of pieces, and we teach kids at a young age how to do that, where there was a time that learning was strictly text-based, and it wasn't that long ago. So it was a huge breakthrough for Comenius to have pictures in his books. And John Locke, he viewed a young child's mind as a blank slate, tabula rasa, on which the education could be imprinted. And you're going to ask you to bring that in here right here. Number 9, tabula rasa, that blank slate. And so, in other words, you could form a child into anything you want them to be through learning. So that was the Dark Ages. Now we have the Awakening, 1700s. So these authors say. We have suggested educational progress in the world was slow and developed in only a few places, and are blaming the church for it. The section demonstrates how many of our current educational ideas can be traced to the early 1700s. So first, this is a part, if you're a person of faith, this is very objectionable to you, in fact, downright aggravating. But the first sentence here, the revolt of intellectuals against superstition and ignorance were dominated in people's lives in the time influenced education in the early modern period. So they're implying here that if you're a person of faith, you're superstitious. And if you're a person of faith and that doesn't agitate you, then I'm not sure you're a person of faith. If you're not a person of faith, you agree with this step. Because you adhere to this premise that intellectuals are not people of faith, and people of faith are not intellectuals, that those are separate things. And that's what the authors are adhering to also. So that statement to me, as a person of faith, is very irritating and objectionable. But it goes with everything else, how this is presented in this chapter. This movement became the keynote period as the Age of Reason. Those who joined the movement came to know as rationalists because of the faith they placed in human rational power. What's human rational power? Humanist. humanist movement. The implication of education in the rationalist movement is obvious. If one places greater emphasis on the human ability to reason, then education takes some new importance in the way of which humans can develop this power. And so again, it is a play on people of faith not being rational people. It's ignorance, besides the belief in human rational power, rationalism. Then just Socrates and Voltaire had their own thing. They laid the foundation of rationalism. Of 3 axioms. And what were those 3 axioms here? So again, this is number 10. Describe rationalism. Not describe, I said 3, 2, 1. Number 10 is these 3 axioms of rationalism. 3 axioms. And that is right here on page 33. Frederick the Great, one of the influential leaders during the Age of Reason, was Frederick the Great. I kind of like that name. I like saying that name, Frederick the Great. During Frederick's reign, Persia passed laws regarding education and required teachers to obtain special training as well as a license to teach. So that was his thing. And so that's what I want to be number 11 here, is that he required them to have special training and get licensed because he believed that education is critical for human empowerment. So morality. Morality in education. Early educational efforts attempted to instill students morals and beliefs of the society in which they existed. These efforts have continued right down through history to our present schools. An example can be found in accompanying Who is Right, a feature in which 2 contemporary educators debate a sex education question. Yeah. What else? Can you imagine anything that draws as much controversy as that? But let me just make this point. This is what's hard for me. Talk about morality and education, but how do you talk about morality without basing it on some higher power? If it's not based on a God or a higher power, what do you base morality on? I know we make the case morality is based on societal norms, but think about that we'll decide what's right based on what others are doing. Oh, you don't believe me? That's how we do it today. We look around, we base on what's moral on what other people are doing. So that's always a hard concept for me, especially how we're kicking the Christian faith in the rear end here. That's hard. But let me take you to this, and this will be your discussion thing. And this is, like I said, it's a good one. The abstinence-only debate. And this will sure fire some of you up and get you all fired and seething here. And please do not respond to this till you've thoroughly read both sides so you can adequately address this. What is perspective on this issue? Abstinence-only education. And what I'm going to do is take you back to the website and go back to this page and going to insert down here below your discussion. And it's a widget. I'm going to insert a widget, which is a discussion area. I'm going to tell it I can have up to 50 things in there. And I save this. And now let me get in here and tell you about it. Who's right in this response? Okay, who is right? Respond to the who is right in this about abstinence only. Okay. And there you go. And that will be number 12. Then we move into the emergence of common man, of the common man. A second pivotal trend in the early modern period affected education was the concept sometimes called the emergence of the common man. Whereas the age of reason was sparked by a revolt in the learned of intellectual freedoms, the thinkers who promoted the emergence of common argued that common people deserve a better life too, politically, economically, socially, and educationally. And so Rousseau, let me give you this name, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and I like saying that name too, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but as a professor, I get to decide how it's pronounced, and so I want to say Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Can you say that? Let me say it one more time for you. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Go ahead, say it. No. Say it louder so I can hear you. Okay, you got it. That'll be just fine. You got it. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose social contract became the influential book during the French Revolution. Rousseau was a philosopher, not an educator, but he wrote a good deal on the subject of education. His most important educational work was Emily, in which he states his views concerning education. Rousseau felt that the aim of education should be to return human beings to their natural state. Naturalism, in their natural state. That's what ideal education is. So, have a little image here to try and describe that. Rousseau's most important contributions were his education must be a natural process, not artificial one, and his compassionate, positive view of the child. Rousseau believed that children were inherently good, a belief in opposition to the prevailing religiosity inspired belief that children were born full of sin. And so he had kind of a contrary thing. So in this naturalism, this is your number 13, describing this naturalism, and that you describe here that he believed children were naturally good, not full of sin. That's 13. Here's another cool one. Pestalozzi, Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi, that's cool to say it like that, was a Swiss educator who put Rousseau's theory into practice. He'd established 2 schools for boys. Educators came from all over the world to view Pestalozzi's schools and study his teaching methods. Pestalozzi enumerated his educational views in this book. Unlike most educators of his time, Pestalozzi believed that a teacher should treat students with love and kindness. And that was not the belief. That was a very contrary belief in his time. Key concepts of that included the expression of love, understanding, patience for children, compassion for the poor, and the use of objects and sense perception as the basis of acquiring knowledge. And again, that was quite contrary because at that time it was simply spoken words, text words, and it was run kind of like a military school. And so again, he had Mr. Pestalozzi had quite a contrary approach to things. Love and kindness. No entry here. I just wanted to underline that for you. Softer, gentler, squeezy. Herbart, Johann Friedrich Herbart, educator who studied under Pestalozzi, was influenced to him. He came up with this Herbartian teaching method that involved these 5 formal steps: preparation, presentation, association, generalization, and application. And I want you to tell me those 5 things here, number 14. 5 things. And make it nice and red so I can find it. And then Friedrich Froebel, his thing was the first kindergarten. He originated the idea that women are best suited to teach young children. Okay, now I'm telling you what a sexist thing to say, and today if he was at a university and he said that, he'd lose his job or we'd beat him emotionally to a pulp or he quit. But at that time, he asserted that women, because based on, remember, he was a disciple of Pestalozzi up here, who believed in a kinder, gentler, soft, kindness, loving type school, and so he asserted that women were in a better position to do that. And I'm just telling you today that would never fly. He'd be fired for asserting such a thing. But back in between 1872 and 1852, he could get away with that. All right, so Friedrich Froebel was the father of kindergarten. And that's what I want you to put here. He established kindergarten, but number 15 is a cool term. You're going to say he was the father of kindergarten. That's number 15. So here again is a piece, this evolving perspectives of education in our rapidly developing nation. The earliest settlers to America from Europe, you know, Columbus on the boat comes here, people start settling here, brought with them a sincere interest in providing at least rudimentary education in their children, because when this was going on, education was really starting to boil again over there in Europe. So when you came here, naturally brought their European ideas with them about education. And soon after that arrival, they created schools and educational programs throughout the colonial America. And this section will briefly describe and examine those colonial programs. So go like this. First, the colonial education time. The early settlements of the East Coast were composed of groups of colonies. The southern colonies that were centered in Virginia, the middle colonies settled in New York, and the northern colonies centered in New England. Each of these groups developed somewhat unique educational systems. What I don't get when I learned about the colonies, I learned the southern colonies, the middle colonies, and the New England colonies. So I'm not quite sure how this northern got in here, or why, or it is, but there it is. So first of all, the southern colonies, they are considered by the authors, they will insist from their perspective, bad colonies, bad people. And why? Because it made up of large tobacco plantations. There was immediate need for cheap labor to work for plantations. And where do you get cheap labor? Africa. You go load up the slaves, and they say within a few years. Other sources of labor to these colonies were that they would go to Europe and buy, people would buy their way to this country with the promise of working on these plantations. We're agreeing to what we call servitude, indentured servitude. So soon became two very distinct classes of people in the South, wealthy landowners and this large mass of labor, most of whom were slaves. And of course the educational provisions for this evolved from this set of conditions were precisely what you would expect. Few were interested in providing anything for slaves and indentured people. With the exception, here in the blue, missionary groups such as English Society came to do this. And why did missionaries want to provide schooling for slaves? I'm going to ask you that right here. This is number 16. Why educate slaves? Why did the missionaries want to educate slaves? Okay, let me go back here. Here's the middle. Large tobacco plantation owners, cheap labor, slaves, indentured servants, wealthy landowners, tutors for their own children, and missionaries provide education to the slaves. Okay, and so the wealthy people, they brought in tutors to educate their people, and when they came of age, they sent them back east, they called it, meaning Europe, to well-established universities, because at that time there really weren't any universities here, and they had the money to do it, they could afford to do it. And the other thing in the southern colonies are really sparse and spread out. They were on huge plantations. We get to the middle colonies, a little bit different. People settled in the middle colonies came from various national backgrounds like Dutch, Swede, Puritans, Mennonites, Catholics, that type. That's why middle colonies have often been called a melting pot of the nation. This diversity of backgrounds make it impossible for the inhabitants of the middle colonies to agree on common public school system. Consequently, the prospective groups established their own religious schools. Everybody had religious. And again, the schools were all religious, of course, because they wanted to teach the kids to read so they could, you got it, read the Bible. Many children received their education through apprenticeships. That was a common thing in the middle colonies, these apprenticeships, learning a trade on the job. While learning a trade from a master already in the line of work, some people even learned the art of teaching school through apprenticeships with experienced teachers. So they couldn't agree, we're too different, and so we start these apprenticeships, and that's kind of what the middle colonies look like, but it's too diverse. Where the northern colonies, or the New England colonies, were the opposites. They were settled mainly by Puritans, religious group from Europe. 1630, approximately 1,000 Puritans settled near Boston. So now we're all the same. We can agree. Unlike southern people, New England lived close to one another. Towns sprang up, soon became centers of political and social life. Shipping ports were established, and an industrial economy developed that demanded numerous skilled and semi-skilled workers, a condition that eventually created a growing middle class and common schools. Why did we need the schools in the northern colonies or the New England colonies? We needed to educate people to do their jobs. It was bustling economy, free trade, free markets, and we needed people to work in them, so we needed to train them. So the early laws for this time came the O Deluder Satan Act. Okay, and that you're going to get that here from the early laws, the O Deluder Satan Act, and this is number 17. You talk about what that is and why they passed that law. The O Deluder Satan Act. Let me come back here. You see here, the Middle Colony is very diverse in their inhabitants. Individual groups established their own religious schools, and they believed in this apprenticeship model. So now, let's go on. Oh, I want to give you this too here about the northern colonies. Live close to one another, towns sprang up, numerous skilled and unskilled laborers. So I don't know where this came from. That is not in the reading. Religious groups, rapid rise, the middle class.